4 methods of creating a business budget for any business. 1. Incremental budget. The incremental budgeting method is perhaps the most commonly used budgeting method because it is simple and easy to understand. This budgeting method simply uses last year's actual numbers and adds or subtracts a percentage to be used on the future year's budget. Pros of incremental budgeting method. Simple and easy to understand, no complex calculations are required since it uses current numbers and adjusts them to account for inflation or revenue growth. Saves time because of how simple it is to create and calculate. Budgets remain pretty consistent over time. Incremental funding helps with funding stability because expenses are pretty easy to predict year over year. Cons of incremental budgeting method. This method could promote unnecessary spending because year over year this type of budget is usually increased by a certain percent. This could make departments feel like they need to spend all of the money in their budget, even though there perhaps was not an actual change in current expenses. Some departments may not need any additional spending dollars but will be allocated them anyways in this method. 2. Activity-based budget. Rather than using actual numbers from a current year, the activity-based budgeting method uses a top-down approach that focuses on the key outcomes a business wishes to achieve in the next period. Activity-based budgeting is great for companies that perhaps do not have enough historical information to create the next period's budget, for example, newer companies that are growing. Pros of activity-based budgeting method. Forward-looking view gives managers insight into where improvements can be made rather than just taking what was done in the previous period and allocating costs based on that. More likely to identify inefficiencies in processes or areas that need more or less in their budget for the future. Helps companies stay goal-focused because the budget uses a top-down approach that allocates resources based on a final end result or goal. Easier to make changes based on climate or current events and helps identify capacity issues. Cons of activity-based budgeting method. Activity-based budgeting is a lengthy and time-consuming process that can become cumbersome and counterproductive if too much time is spent on analyzing. Requires individuals who have experience with budgeting, fiscal planning, and are able to find gaps and/or overlaps. Activity-based budgeting can sometimes lead to short-term thinking of goals and the overall big picture may be lost in the process. This method is based on future forecasting which can be unreliable if the end results are not as planned. This can lead to serious cash flow issues if the budget is not carefully and thoroughly thought out. Activity-based budgeting definitely uses a more strategic approach to budgeting than the other methods listed in this article. It requires more time and a significant amount of resources in order to be done correctly. 3. Zero-based budget. Zero-based budgeting is, as the name suggests, a zero starting point, or blank slate. With this budgeting approach, managers must create their budget categories and items and justify each item without reference to the prior year's numbers. An item that was on the budget last year doesn't necessarily need to be on the budget in the future, unless it can be justified and a continued need is identified. Pros of zero-based budgeting method. Excellent method for eliminating unnecessary expenses or waste. Holds managers accountable for costs and aggressively streamlines inflated budgets. Helps companies bring costs under control while minimizing any negative impact on operations. Cons of zero-based budgeting method. This is a very time-consuming method that requires time, resources, and review. This method may reward short-term thinking rather than long-term, big-picture thinking. For example, research and development is often considered a long-term investment but may be left with less allocation of funds, even though they are needed in the short term. Possible manipulation by savvy managers who are looking to squeeze more resources into their departments. 4. Value proposition budget. The value proposition budgeting method is a happy medium between incremental budgeting and zero-based budgeting. Incremental budgeting perhaps doesn't scrutinize each item or category on the budget enough, while zero-based budgeting perhaps scrutinizes each item or category too much. Pros of value proposition budgeting method. This method helps leaders identify items that bring the most value and remove the ones that bring no value or don't benefit the business concept statement. Helps create a strong differentiate between you and your competitors by identifying the company's key value points, helping you emphasize on those for the next period. Cons of value proposition budgeting method. Value can be a difficult thing to quantify. This can lead to more short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking. Sometimes items are more complex than just identifying their value, and this can lead to perhaps cutting items that are important, but do not have an immediate value.